Because Priscilla Presley was only 14 when she started dating Elvis Presley, it's not surprising that her own life got overshadowed by his fame.
I didn't have my teenage years as a normal.
On the surface, Elvis Presley seemed to have it all. The king of rock and roll. The one man who captured the hearts of millions and created a legacy that would endure long after his time. But there was more to his story, more to his personal life than the world ever knew. The man whose voice still echoes through the halls of history was also a man burdened by loneliness, infidelity, and a constant yearning for something real. And through it all, there was one woman who shared this tumultuous journey, Priscilla Presley. Their love story began in a foreign land, far from the fame and adoration of Elvis's fans. A story of innocence and youth, of overwhelming love and crippling doubts. A marriage that began with hope but ended in the harsh reality of heartbreak. This is the true story of their relationship, a journey of highs and lows, of devotion and pain, a love story that was never quite as perfect as the world made it out to be. Priscilla Beaulieu was just 14 years old when she first set foot on the military base in West Germany. It was the summer of 1959, a time of new beginnings, uncertainty, and the promise of a fresh start. Her father, an Air Force officer, had been transferred there, and the Beaulieu family was setting up a new life in an unfamiliar country. But it wasn't just the military base that would shape her future, it was the presence of one man, Elvis Presley. Elvis, drafted into the Army in 1958, had been stationed in Germany. Life as a soldier was drastically different from the rock and roll stardom he was used to, but his fame still hung over him. Priscilla was unaware that her path was about to cross with his in a way that would change both of their lives forever. Priscilla was a shy young girl, recently crowned Queen of Del Valle Junior High, but she felt out of place in this new setting. As she arrived in Germany with her family, the excitement and fear of change weighed heavily on her. It wasn't long before she was introduced to Elvis thanks to a mutual connection, Curry Grant, a fellow Air Force member who was stationed at the base. Priscilla was nervous. She had never met a celebrity before, let alone the king of rock and roll. The idea that someone like Elvis Presley would even acknowledge her felt unreal. Priscilla remembers that moment clearly. Elvis immediately caught her off guard. Rather than treating her like a fan, he treated her with kindness and attention. He played songs for her on his piano and even introduced her to his beloved grandmother, Minnie Mae Presley. The way Elvis made her feel special left a lasting impression on her. In her autobiography, Elvis and Me, Priscilla shared how she felt both overwhelmed and enchanted by the attention. The initial meeting lasted much longer than expected, and by the time she finally returned home, it was already 2 a.m. Despite how late it was, Priscilla found herself falling in love with this charismatic man. Elvis, in return, was immediately drawn to her. They shared several conversations over the next few days, and Elvis even called to arrange another meeting. However, Priscilla was not the only one on Elvis's mind. At the time, Elvis was also seeing a 19-year-old German woman named Elizabeth Stefania. Their relationship had been developing since late 1958, just before Priscilla came into the picture. While Priscilla was falling for Elvis, Stefania was becoming increasingly jealous of her presence in Elvis's life. Priscilla, aware of the tension but unable to fully grasp the complexities of Elvis's personal life, was completely enchanted by the attention he gave her. In Elvis and Me, she reflects on how Elvis made her feel important and special, something she hadn't experienced before. It wasn't long before she was caught up in the whirlwind of Elvis's world. As their relationship blossomed, Priscilla quickly found herself caught in a tumultuous, high-pressure world she hadn't anticipated. The life of an army brat was already full of challenges, but dating one of the most famous musicians in the world added a whole new level of difficulty. In Elvis and Me, Priscilla described the constant whirlwind of Elvis's life. There were moments when she would travel with him, only to find herself overwhelmed by the excitement of being surrounded by his entourage and the constant media attention. She was still so young, and while she loved being close to Elvis, she didn't always know how to handle the demands of his lifestyle. During Christmas of 1962, Priscilla went to visit Elvis for a quick holiday reunion. Since they had limited time together, they tried to make the most of it by cramming in as many activities as possible. In one instance, Elvis gave Priscilla 2 large red pills to help her relax, but the result was far from what either of them expected. She ended up passing out for 2 days. completely knocked out by the drugs Elvis had given her. This was the second time Priscilla had used drugs with Elvis. Earlier that summer, she had accompanied him to Las Vegas, where she felt pressured to keep up with his frenetic lifestyle. In her autobiography, she described how she began taking amphetamines and sleeping pills just to stay awake and participate in the whirlwind that was Elvis's life. For Priscilla, adjusting to the speed of Elvis's world was no easy feat. There were times when she struggled to balance the excitement with the overwhelming exhaustion. Despite the chaos, she tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, continuing her education while seeing Elvis almost every night. In Elvis and Me, she recalls how hard it was to focus on her schoolwork after a night spent with him. Her thoughts were consumed with him, and she found it nearly impossible to concentrate. In 1963, after Priscilla's family moved back to the United States, she persuaded her parents to let her move to Memphis to be closer to Elvis. She was still a teenager, just beginning high school, but her relationship with Elvis was already taking up much of her attention. Every night they would stay out until the early hours of the morning, and Priscilla would barely have a few hours of sleep before she had to get up for school. Priscilla recalls in Elvis and Me that her grades suffered as a result. She found it difficult to balance the demands of being Elvis's girlfriend with her schoolwork, but despite the struggle, she was willing to endure it all just to spend more time with him. For Priscilla, being close to Elvis was worth the sacrifices she made. As Priscilla and Elvis's relationship continued, it became more apparent that their connection was deeply complicated. Priscilla was in love, but there were issues that Elvis had not yet revealed to her. One of those issues was his continuing relationship with Elizabeth Stefania. As their relationship progressed, Priscilla couldn't ignore the growing distance between them, a distance caused not only by Elvis's relationship with others, but also by the increasing pressures of fame and the toll it was taking on his personal life. In her autobiography, Priscilla speaks candidly about how challenging it was to adjust to life with Elvis, how she began to question his feelings for her, and how she was slowly starting to realize that the man she was falling in love with wasn't quite the man she had imagined. As the months passed, Priscilla Beaulieu found herself increasingly entrenched in Elvis Presley's world, a world far removed from the simplicity of her teenage years. What began as a whirlwind romance fueled by Elvis's charm and the magic of rock and roll fame was quickly evolving into something more complex and, at times, overwhelming. By 1963, Priscilla had made the difficult decision to move to Memphis, Tennessee to be closer to Elvis. She was just 17, still attending high school, but her life had already taken on a different rhythm. She was no longer just a high school student trying to navigate adolescence. She was the girlfriend of Elvis Presley, a young woman caught up in the frenzy of a superstar's life. Though she was living in Elvis's world, she still had to live her own life as a teenager. Between attending school and spending time with Elvis, it felt like there was no time for her to breathe. She was constantly trying to balance the two worlds. In Elvis and Me, Priscilla reflects on how difficult this balance was to maintain. I was torn between being a typical teenager and being Elvis's girlfriend, she wrote. It was hard to keep up with my schoolwork knowing that my thoughts were always consumed with Elvis. At the time, Priscilla wasn't just a spectator in Elvis's world, she was a participant. She attended Hollywood parties, visited sets, and was frequently in the company of Elvis's entourage. However, these experiences, while glamorous, only served to underline her isolation. She wasn't fully integrated into the world that Elvis moved through, nor did she entirely fit into her old life as a high school student. The relationship between Priscilla and Elvis began to develop in a way that was both intimate and strained. As Priscilla spent more time with Elvis, she began to see the dark side of his fame. Despite his public persona as the charismatic, confident king of rock and roll, behind closed doors, Elvis was struggling with personal demons, primarily loneliness and the pressures of his celebrity. In Elvis and Me, Priscilla described how she watched Elvis start to rely more heavily on prescription drugs. She witnessed how Elvis's emotional state would fluctuate drastically, swinging between high energy and deep depression. It became apparent to Priscilla that while Elvis was often surrounded by people, he still felt alone. And as she spent more time with him, she too began to feel the loneliness that came with being the girlfriend of a man so deeply entrenched in his fame. Despite these challenges, Priscilla remained deeply in love with Elvis. She had never known anyone quite like him. His charm, his vulnerability, and the deep affection he showed her kept her attached to him even when their relationship became difficult. In Elvis and Me, she wrote about the moments they shared, the private conversations, the times when Elvis made her feel like the only person in the room. For Priscilla, these moments were what kept her going, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. In 1963, Elvis returned to Hollywood to begin shooting the film Viva Las Vegas, a movie that would pair him with the rising star Anne-Margaret. At the time, Priscilla was living in Memphis, and though Elvis had promised her he would stay faithful, Priscilla couldn't help but feel uneasy as the press began to circulate rumors about Elvis and Anne-Margaret's off-screen relationship. In Elvis and Me, Priscilla recalled how, upon hearing about the growing media frenzy around Elvis and Anne-Margaret, she became increasingly anxious. She wasn't in Hollywood, and the distance between her and Elvis made her feel even more vulnerable to the rumors. Priscilla knew that Elvis had always been surrounded by beautiful women, but seeing his relationship with Anne-Margaret being splashed across magazine covers was a difficult pill to swallow. Despite her reservations, Priscilla decided she would visit him on set to confront him about the rumors. After several months of hearing nothing but excuses, she demanded to come to Hollywood. At first, Elvis seemed reluctant, but eventually he agreed. Priscilla arrived on the set of Viva Las Vegas and was immediately confronted by the paparazzi. However, her visit to the set didn't go as planned. On the final day of production, the press published an article claiming that Anne-Margaret and Elvis were romantically involved and even engaged. The article was later refuted by Anne-Margaret, who claimed that the interview had been fabricated by the press. But the damage was done. Priscilla, devastated by the allegations, was left to process her feelings. In Elvis and Me, she explained how she felt betrayed, even though Elvis had promised that there was nothing between him and Anne-Margaret. Elvis attempted to calm Priscilla's concerns by assuring her that he had ended things with Anne-Margaret and promised to never see her again. However, the reality was much different. Elvis continued to communicate with Anne-Margaret secretly, further deepening Priscilla's suspicions and emotional turmoil. In the aftermath of the media frenzy, Elvis and Priscilla's relationship became strained. Though they tried to move past the incident, it was clear that trust had been damaged and the cracks in their relationship were beginning to show. Priscilla's feelings of insecurity, combined with the pressures of their complicated lives, weighed heavily on her. In her autobiography, she openly discusses how at that point she began to question whether Elvis was truly committed to her. Despite the pain she felt, Priscilla was still in love with him, and she clung to the hope that things would improve. But deep down, she knew their relationship was changing, and that change wasn't necessarily for the better. As their love story continued, the intensity of their connection grew, but so did the difficulties they faced. In a world where fame, infidelity, and addiction played a major role, Priscilla and Elvis's relationship became increasingly difficult to navigate. What had started as a fairy tale romance was quickly becoming a complicated, painful journey. In many ways, Priscilla was torn between the love she had for Elvis and the toll that his fame, infidelity, and emotional turmoil were taking on her. The pressures of living in Elvis's world, coupled with her growing feelings of isolation and insecurity, created a storm of emotions that Priscilla was beginning to realize might be more than she could handle. By 1967, Priscilla Presley had been with Elvis for several years. They had experienced many highs and lows, but the overwhelming sense of pressure and scrutiny had begun to take its toll. Elvis was now one of the most famous men in the world, and Priscilla was not only dealing with the challenges of being in a relationship with him, but also the intense spotlight that came with being the wife of the king of rock and roll. Their relationship had been marked by intense emotions and deep affection, but also by strain, especially as Elvis's career continued to soar and his personal issues began to weigh more heavily on both of them. The couple was navigating a turbulent time, and Priscilla was increasingly finding herself struggling to balance her own needs with the demands of being married to a global icon. Priscilla and Elvis had been dating for almost 8 years when they finally decided to marry in a private ceremony in Las Vegas on May 1st, 1967. In her autobiography, Elvis and Me, Priscilla recounts the whirlwind of emotions she felt during that time. Though she was excited about becoming Mrs. Elvis Presley, there was also a deep sense of unease. She was just 21, still very young and trying to figure out who she was, while also adapting to the world of fame and constant media attention that came with marrying one of the most famous men in the world. The wedding itself was a very private affair as the couple wanted to avoid public attention. They entered the Aladdin Hotel through a back entrance to avoid the paparazzi, and the ceremony was attended by only a small group of people. Most of Elvis's close friends, including members of his famous entourage, were not invited. Despite the quiet nature of the wedding, the press was still able to capture photos, and the newlyweds were quickly thrust into the spotlight as the press clamored to get a glimpse of the couple's first moments as husband and wife. Priscilla had to adjust quickly to her new role as Elvis's wife. The honeymoon that followed was an extravagant one, with the couple flying in Frank Sinatra's private jet to Palm Springs, California. However, even on their honeymoon, the constant media attention made it difficult for Priscilla to truly relax and enjoy the time with her new husband. The couple was met with throngs of reporters and photographers wherever they went, and Priscilla couldn't escape the constant scrutiny that came with being married to Elvis. In Elvis and Me, Priscilla admits that during these early years of marriage, she often felt isolated. Though she loved Elvis deeply, she was still a young woman trying to find her identity. "I was still so young," she writes. "I didn't know who I was outside of being Elvis's wife. The pressure of being constantly in the spotlight and the demands of living up to the expectations of being married to him were overwhelming." It wasn't just the external pressures that were affecting their marriage. Elvis was also struggling with his own demons, including his growing dependency on prescription drugs and his emotional instability. As Priscilla became more immersed in Elvis's world, she began to notice how much his dependence on medication was affecting their relationship. Elvis had always been someone who struggled with feelings of loneliness, and his fame only seemed to exacerbate these feelings. Despite having a seemingly perfect life, Elvis was often caught in a cycle of highs and lows that would leave him emotionally distant and erratic. Priscilla, in turn, was caught in the middle of this turmoil. As she dealt with the demands of being a young wife, she also had to face the fact that Elvis was becoming more and more unpredictable. She described how he would often retreat into himself, leaving her feeling neglected and unsure of how to help him. The couple's relationship began to show signs of strain, even though they still cared deeply for each other. By 1968, Priscilla had given birth to their only child, Lisa Marie Presley, on February 1st. The arrival of their daughter brought some joy and happiness to their relationship, but it also added another layer of complexity. While Elvis doted on his daughter and was proud of being a father, the pressures of parenthood, combined with the ongoing issues in their marriage, continued to create tension between the couple. At this point, Priscilla was trying to balance her role as a mother, wife, and individual. She was still very much in the process of growing into herself, but she often felt like she was losing her sense of identity. In her autobiography, Priscilla described how she tried to focus on being a good mother and a supportive wife, but the constant presence of fame and the challenges it brought made it difficult for her to maintain a sense of self. Elvis, too, was struggling with his own identity. His career, which had once been a source of excitement and fulfillment, was starting to feel like a burden. By the late 1960s, Elvis's career was in a bit of a slump. His films were not performing as well at the box office, and he began to feel as though he was losing his place in the music industry. This feeling of dissatisfaction, combined with his reliance on drugs and alcohol, only served to exacerbate the problems in his personal life. As Priscilla continued to adjust to life as Elvis's wife, she began to realize that their marriage was far from perfect. In Elvis and Me, she writes that while she was deeply in love with Elvis, she was also beginning to feel the weight of the emotional distance that had formed between them. The carefree days of their early relationship seemed far behind them, replaced by a more complex and often painful reality. Elvis, despite his affection for Priscilla, was increasingly distracted by the pressures of his career and personal struggles. He continued to rely on drugs, and his physical and emotional health deteriorated. As Priscilla looked at their marriage, she started to question whether their relationship could survive the pressures of fame, addiction, and personal discontent. The external pressures, the constant public scrutiny, and the issues within their marriage led to a growing sense of isolation for both Priscilla and Elvis. While they continued to love each other, it became clear that their marriage was not the fairy tale it had once seemed to be. In fact, the years ahead would prove to be even more challenging for the couple, as they each struggled with their own personal battles. The love they shared was undeniable, but it was also complicated by the weight of their fame, their own personal insecurities, and the emotional distance that was growing between them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Elvis and Priscilla's tumultuous yet captivating story. Their relationship, full of love, challenges, and the pressures of fame, reminds us that even the brightest stars have their struggles. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another chapter of this incredible journey. See you in the next video.